Vidhammer Fantasy.
Welcome back to Vidhammer. I'm Smudlow, and in this video, I'll be going over the first round matchup at a December 2013 tournament at Darkside Comics in Sarasota, Florida. I'm bringing more of a melee-oriented list this time. In fact, the only shooting I have to speak of is a pack of 7 gutter runners and the bolts from my doom wheel. In exchange, I put the plague furnace back in and add a couple of giant rat redirectors. Otherwise, I've still got the horde block of storm vermin, 2 blocks of 30 clan rats, the rat ogres, and the abomination. For characters, I'm going with the warlord on a rat ogre bonebreaker again as my army general, followed up with my chieftain BSB with Skaven brew, and 3 casters. The staple Grey Seer with the Power Scroll splits his spell selection evenly between the 2 lores and ends up with Scorch, Plague, Wither, and the dreaded 13th, while the Plague Priest with the Dispel Scroll gets Cloud of Corruption and Blessed with Filth, and my Warlock Engineer with a Doom Rocket and Warp Energy Condenser ends up with Warp Lightning. Across the table, there are 2 large blocks of skeletons and 1 of ghouls, along with a pack of 7 Hex Wraiths, a group of 12 Black Knights, and a Coven Throne. Leading the army is Heinrich Kemmler, who's a lore master of the lore of vampires. Then there's a level 2 vampire riding the Coven Throne that has Hellish Vigor and Wind of Undeath, as well as a level 1 vampire on a Hellsteed that ends up with Dance Macabre. Only his ghouls are held in reserve, but my warlord, Doomwheel, rat ogres, slaves, and 1 clan rat block are all held in reserve. I'm aware of the whole fashionably late thing, but this is a little excessive. I put what's left of my army up on the starting line with only a single rat dart on the right side of that house. I decide to put the gutter runners as close as I can to the Coven Throne as I can manage. It's the only real target that I have. I hold on to the first turn and kick off the game as my other start-of-game elements have the Grey Seer getting 2 Warpstone tokens and the Storm Vermin drinking the Skaven brew and getting the Frenzy effect. An additional scenario element is that the visible distance changes, so each turn an artillery die is rolled, and units only see 3 times the distance rolled. Our first turn roll was a 6, so the frenzied Storm Vermin had to test a restrain from charging this turn, and we subsequently forget about this rule for the rest of the game. With no charges, the Hell Pit gets an average distance forwards, and I march all the other units up as well. I try to put the rat darts up to redirect the lower end of his battle line, and I bring all my reinforcements on the table as well. Since everything is already jammed up above the house, my only decent choice is to have my units come in on the bottom. But with the house in the way, I'm relatively certain that the rat ogres and slaves aren't going to make it into combat for this game. I'd love to waste the slaves on those cavalry, or even better on the Hex Wraiths, but I guess they suspected that and decided to spectate for this round. Our first magic phase ends up 7 versus 5. I use my first 2 dice for Blessed with Filth on the Storm Vermin to give them poison attacks, a little bit of a buff. I was hoping to give him incentive not to charge me on his turn, but he dispels it with 2 of his own. I used my next 2 to have my Warlock Engineer cast Warp Lightning on the Hex Wraiths, since that's the only direct way I have of hurting those things, short of the Doomwheel's bolts. That's a long way away. Not liking the sounds of the extra hits, Mike uses his last 3 dice to dispel it. With 3 uncontested dice left, I go for Plague on the Skeletal Spearman and manage 15 wounds, then the spell ends. In shooting, the gutter runners get 5 poison wounds out of 10 shots that were within range, but still only put a single wound on the Coven Throne. Then I cap off my Doom Rocket at the hurt skeletons, since I can't actually see the Black Knights from the fog effect. It ends up 1 inch over my target area and takes out another 16 skeletons from his central unit. There's no more damage I can do, so the vampires retaliate with 3 charges into the Storm Vermin, and the upper skeletons, not wanting to be left out, go ahead and charge the Plague Monks. I know I'll end up winning the upper combat, but it's going to take a couple of turns, so the lower half of my line is going to have to find some way of countering his cavalry. Luckily for me, the Hex Wraiths don't make it into combat, so I stand a great chance of killing off the Coven Throne from combat resolution, since I'm probably not going to hurt it in actual combat. The ghouls come on the board, and the cavalry swing up for the second turn flank charge on whatever is left in the center. His magic ends up 11 versus 6. He uses his first 4 for Dance Macabre, which, once you realize it, not only will this put the Hex Wraiths into combat, but it's going to let the cavalry hit the Rat Dart and subsequently overrun into the flank of the Storm Vermin and continue fighting in this round. Somehow the planets aligned in my favor and he failed the spell. Otherwise, that was not going to be good. He uses his next 5 dice to go for Wind of Undeath, and I use all of my dice to dispel it. Finally, he uses his last 2 dice for Hellish Vigor on his Coven Throne, so he can re-roll the wound rolls. For shooting, the Banshee screams at the Rat Dart for 7 wounds, sending them packing. Then the Vampire Lord uses a scream off of his sword, but fails to get any wounds on the Storm Vermin. As combat starts, we tie on our rolls for the Coven Throne's special ability, so nothing happens there. Then his Vampire issues a challenge which I promptly refuse to move my BSB out of harm's way. I take a few wounds from his Vampire, then the Storm Vermin only put a single wound on the Coven Throne, but finish off the 9 remaining skeletons before taking 1 from the Coven Throne in return. I win the battle by enough to finish off the throne in crumbling, as we move over to our upper combat. The Plague Furnace's Shrouded by Fog effect takes out 4 of my own Plague Monks and a few skeletons to get things started. The Plague Priest gets 4 wounds thanks to his flail, and the rest of the Plague Monks manage 2 more before taking 4 in return. Then, for some dumbass reason, I make the Wrecker attack, which I know only happens on my turn. I apparently need those glowing turn and player markers in my real life. He should have more skeletons left over, which might have delayed the Hell Pit from later actions as it turns out. On to the second turn, I have the Storm Vermin and the Rat Dart charge into the Knights, but avoid the Hex Wraiths, who were a couple of inches back. Then the Abomination joins in on the skeleton's flank, as the Doom Wheel advances to my amazement. I move up the lower units, hoping to get around that house eventually, but that doesn't end up working out, and with 2 units there, I should have split them up, but oh well. Magic ends up 6 versus 4 this time, and I throw all 6 at Wither on the Black Knights, without getting Irresistible Force, but it was still a high enough cast not to get dispelled. The Doom Wheel restrains from shooting my own unit, and the Gutter Runners go ahead and shoot at the ghouls for 4 relatively meaningless wounds. Back into the upper combat, the Hell Pit gets 1 impact hit, and Shrouded by Fog was skipped for some reason. The Plague Priest deals out 1 more, the skeletons take down 2 monks and save 3 wounds in return, but lose 5 to the Wrecker and the Hell Pit. The remaining skeletons crumble, and I didn't think I could get an overrun, but I was informed that recent FAQ editions allowed it, so the Hell Pit overruns 15 inches. In the lower combat, I decline another challenge, and my Rat Dart manages the only wound from my side, since I decided to neglect that whole Wither effect on the Knights. I take 4 in return, but due to my ranks, along with the charge and flank bonuses, I end up winning the combat by 1. And I reform to bring as much as I can against the Knights that I can actually kill. For the Vampires, they charge the Hex Wraiths into the combat, and the ghouls turn to face the pesky Gutter Runners. Mike gets double 6s for the magic phase, and nobody channels, so I settle in for a beating. He starts out with 4 dice for Wind of Undeath, and he got a high roll, so I used my Dispel Scroll on this, because I thought it would chew up my Storm Vermin. But a little math breakdown suggests that it would only do about 5 to 6 wounds on average, even without the armor saves. He uses his next 2 dice for Dance Macabre, and I use 3 to make sure I get a Dispel on this one. His next 2 dice go for hellish vigor on the Black Knights, and I let this one go, thinking that some more worthwhile stuff is coming up. He uses the next 2 for Curse of Years, and I don't want to have to waste my power dice to dispel this, so I go ahead and use 2 of mine to dispel it. Finally, he goes for Dance Macabre again with his remaining 2 dice, but it doesn't go off. Now over to shooting, or more like screaming as it would be. The Banshee screams into the combat for 4 wounds, and the Vampire goes for it, but doesn't get any again. Once in combat, though, he manages 3 wounds by himself. The Storm Vermin do 4, then the White King does a couple, and the Hex Wraiths and Knights end up doing 7 more. It looks like I have a second rank of 5, but I guess I didn't, because I lose the combat by 6 and get cut down when I ran, with the Wraiths and Knights overrunning into the Clan Rats behind. The Giant Rats get away, though, so thank goodness. On the 3rd turn, I can't get any charges on anything, but the Doom Wheel and Hell Pit both manage to make it into the big combat, and the Giant Rats even manage to rally. The Plague Monks do manage to fail their Swift Reform roll, though, so that gets me feeling back to normal. Without a musician, the Rat Ogres can only reform, and the slaves just keep watching the action. Magic is 8 versus 4 this time, and I start with a late move of the Gutter Runners out of the front arc of the Ghouls. Then I use 4 dice for Wither on the Hex Race that he dispels with his 4 dice. The remaining dice I use for Plague, right in the big combat. Oh yeah. The White King takes a wound, plus 6 more on the Hex Race, which is what I was looking for. Unfortunately, 14 Clan Rats die, and my Engineer takes a wound as well. Not so oh yeah. In shooting, the Doom Wheel finally gets to cap off its shots into combat, takes out 2 more Hex Wraiths. On to combat, the Hell Pit actually has Warpstone spikes, so all of its attacks are magical, and manages 3 impact hits on the Hex Wraiths. Kemmler issues another challenge, and my Grey Seer takes a turn in the back this time. He does 3 wounds, and the White King gets 4 more. The Clan Rats put a wound on Kemmler, and the Hex Wraiths take out about 7 Clan Rats. Finally, the Hell Pit does 4 wounds and attacks, and 1 more from his Thunderstomp. After everything, I end up winning the combat by 3, and the Knight unit crumbles, plus a wound on the Vampire Rider, and a couple of Wraiths go down as well. On the Vampire's turn, their only movement is another turn back towards the Gutter Runners. Their magic ends up 8 versus 5 this time. He uses 5 for Wind of Undeath, and I say heck with it and just let it go. It hits right over our combat. The Vampire Riders take another wound, the Banshee dies, and 2 wounds carry over to Kemmler. The Abomination takes a wound, the Doom Wheel dodges it all, and the Clan Rats die down to the Standard Bearer. He uses his last 4 dice for Invocation of Nehek, and takes all 5 of my dice to fail at dispelling this one. Yeah, I'm kicking butt. The characters regain some wounds, but fortunately, in the Screaming phase, the sword goes 0 for 3 and doesn't manage to get any wounds. As our combat continues, the Grey Seer no longer has anywhere to hide, and he gets cut down by the Vampire Rider. The Clan Rat Standard Bearer dies as well, and the Hell Pit takes a wound before smashing Kemmler with his fists. I end up losing the combat by 2, but the Warlock Engineer ends up with insane courage. The Doom Wheel passes on a 5, and the stubborn Hell Pit sticks around as well. In the top of our 4th and final turn, I have the Giant Rats and the Gutter Runners both charge the combat. They both make it, and the other units just jostle around for a better vantage point. It was my turn for double 6s in the magic phase, and with only 1 spell worth casting and not wanting to risk a miscast, I just pushed them all aside. Wish I could have gotten that roll a little bit earlier. The Doom Wheel fails to wound in shooting, and finishing out this combat, the Doom Wheel manages to grind the 2 wounds back on the Vampire Rider before we do a late move of the Vortex that hits the Rat Ogres, killing off a Packmaster and putting 1 on a Rat Ogre. Back in combat, the White King manages 4 flaming attacks on the abomination and takes it down. The rest of my crew doesn't do a darn thing, and I end up down 5 in this combat. The Doom Wheel, Gutter Runners, and Giant Rats spread like the 3 winds as we call the game, and finally take a look at the bonus victory conditions. For this round I came away with a major victory, and we each got a bonus point for killing off the other side's cheapest unit. Time for some pizza and get things set up for the second round, where I go up against lizard men with a lot of Saurus on the board. Hope you enjoy this battle report. Be sure and check back for more videos each week. Do me a favor and subscribe, like the video if you want to see more, and as always, send me a comment if you have any tactics or matchups you'd like to see. Till next time for Vidhammer, keep fighting.